Hello and welcome to another HanDrinksSolo wine info video, and today we are talking about the Strandveld Syrah 2020. Strandveld are one of the more established Elim stalwarts, positioned somewhere between Elim and Cape Agulhas. And you might be asking, where the heck is that? Well, that is part of a little group of producers called the Agulhas Wine Triangle, which is really down on the very southern tip of the African continent. This fascinating little group of producers operate about 225 kilometers southeast of Cape Town. And the reason that this little group is so important is because they are delivering some truly distinctive Syrahs and Sauvignon Blancs that are raking in far more wine awards than this group should be, statistically speaking. Now, the impact that this region has made on the perception of South African Syrah, both locally and internationally, has been huge, to the point where the concept of a coastal Syrah really has become its own standalone category. Perhaps what makes this so valid is that in the glass it really does deliver a sensory profile very different to anything else that is being produced around South Africa.
And what is that exactly?
Well, luckily, the Strandveld Syrah 2020 is an absolute textbook example of what South African coastal Syrah has to offer. So let's give it a sniff and see. Well, on the nose, it is supremely moody. I mean, almost manic depressive. This is more serious than a Michael Mann flick. There are these surly, dried herb elements, a touch of fennel, cloves, crushed stone, flint, and then the obvious black pepper, all sitting up front. And then, almost as an afterthought, there's some quite fresh and engaging black currant fruit touched by oaky vanilla. Now, when we take a sip, we are immediately reminded of this endless debate about the difference between Shiraz and Syrah. Now, if the theory is correct that the difference lies in style alone, then this wine is most certainly in Camp Syrah. The palate is just so light. It's like Chris O'Donnell in tights. Then the fruit elements, which perhaps weren't super obvious on the nose, but that blackberry fruit, just so fresh, clean, pristine, and it's even further polished by some quite pronounced, almost eye-watering red cherry acidity that lifts the whole affair and leaves your mouth watering like a beagle in a butchery. And of course, fruit aside, the black pepper and fennel and dried herbs that you smelt so centrally on the aroma can't help but wash across the palate, maintaining that sense of really rather moody, savory seriousness. And then, almost in contrast, the tannins are actually quite fine. But I would say, for the most part, this wine probably leans a little more into its acidity to provide structure. And finally, on the finish, it is all blackberry fruit. It's almost awkward how long this fruit lingers. It's downright rude. It's almost like it's interrupting you, stopping you from taking your next sip. You keep on waiting for it to finish being on the palate, but it's still there. In my mind, this really is a very distinctive bottle of wine that speaks of the place, of Elim, or more generally, of South African South Coast Shiraz. The wines that are coming out of it really do sit in stark contrast to what is generally perceived to be South African Shiraz, which is about big layers of rich black fruit and not much else. And I think we've reached the point where you cannot claim to have a handle on South African Shiraz without having fully explored this category of Elim, Cape Agulhas, South Coast Shiraz. Of course, all this talk of shifting categories had me wondering, well, where is South African Shiraz heading? And I know that there are some of my favorite winemakers who would be aghast to hear that I would only mention Elim as a category against the big, rich, riper styles of South African Shiraz. So I thought, well, let me go and ask my favorite winemakers from around the country the question, if they had to make Shiraz or Syrah from one site for the rest of their lives, what site would they choose? Is there one above all the rest that would stand out as the representation of South African Shiraz? Now, one might have expected from this survey answers like, oh, definitely it's in the Swartland, or definitely Stellenbosch Shiraz, or it has to be Elim Shiraz. But what was really quite interesting as these winemakers began to get back to me one by one was less a case of a region, and rather they spoke about the qualities of particular sites. 4 elements that make up what I've called the WASA framework for picking sites of South African Syrah. Those are, very briefly, wind, a partial byproduct of altitude, but also a massive factor in how fruit develops on a vine. And there's a whole bunch of fascinating studies just about how wind affects berry size on a vine. The next thing I noticed was altitude, obviously. Whether it was Poker Dry Hills or Ceres or Cedarburg or Elgin, altitude was always a factor that popped up in the sites that made winemakers most excited. The third one is soil. And no, it's not just decomposed granite. Winemakers are producing incredible wines at sites of altitude, in shale, and even in very poor sandy soils. And finally, the last element that popped up regularly was aspect. Southern slopes seem to get mentioned a lot, and mostly because winemakers are looking for sites that give slightly lower levels of solar radiation. What do we do with this framework? Do we go start hunting back labels for elevation numbers and solar radiation stats? No, because you're definitely not going to find them. But I thought it was interesting for us as consumers to understand what our winemaking heroes are looking for in Syrah sites, so that when we are engaging with wines, perhaps in a little more detail, we can begin to listen out for those same things. So that's all we have time for today. But if you are watching this on the HanDrinksSolo YouTube channel, then why not subscribe to the channel so that you can learn all about wine science, viticulture, wine history, or rising winemaking stars coming out of the South African winelands.